It's time to take a ride on the Steelers Afternoon Drive with our co-hosts Alan Saunders and Zachary Smith.
Welcome into another edition of Steelers Afternoon Drive. I'm Zachary Smith. That is Alan Saunders. Joining us as he does weekly, Chris Carter. What is going on, fellas?
What's up, guys?
Yeah, I said weekly, but you weren't on here last week, so welcome back to the show.
Hey, Thanksgiving stuff gets in the way, man.
Holidays, it's tough.
Yes.
Understanding. The man has like 14 and a half jobs, all right?
This is very true. I do have like about 14 and a half.
Give him some slack here.
Well, listen, we'll give Chris some slack. I'm hoping that the audience of this show can give me some slack. I want to get out in front of this and issue a public apology for yesterday. The post on the Steelers Now website for yesterday's show had the incorrect YouTube embed, so it had the previous day's show on it. Wanted to issue a public apology to everybody, get out in front of this thing, apologize to the team in front of everybody. I had a Deontay Johnson moment yesterday, and I promise that it won't happen again.
That's good. I mean, this is what needs to do. Accountability, and now we can never talk about it again. So this is
right.
I think we're on the same page here.
Which is how I'm 100% hoping the Deontay Johnson stuff goes as well. He talked today to the media, hoping that's the last that we hear of it. I'm sure, knowing Steelers fans, that it will be the last that we know of it, right? I mean, those guys and girls never hold on to anything.
Yeah, I mean, there was a guy I mentioned yesterday who was very mad at Deontay Johnson and said, like, I've always hated Deontay Johnson since he didn't get lined up in time and made the Steelers take a penalty in the 2-minute drill against the Dolphins, and I don't know, like 2021 or something. And I was like,
that is old.
That never happened. I was like, I don't know what I guess first he said 2022, and I was like, yeah, that wasn't a thing that happened. And then he said, no, it's 2021. I'm like, they didn't play the Dolphins in 2020. Like, I was like, the guys just like made up a reason to hate
19 or 22 were the two options.
And like a fever dream or something. So yeah, I mean, listen, I guess on the scope of things, if you're going to be mad at Deontay Johnson for something that he actually did do, I suppose that is better than being mad at Deontay Johnson for something that you invented in your own mind.
That's you got to have a special type of hate to like have a dream where this happened and hate him for it. But we actually are going to have.
I don't know how much football and alcohol consumption go hand in hand here. I'm not saying. I'm just saying. Okay, like I'm just,
Yeah, I agree. I think that we should have an interesting discussion today, kind of going away from your traditional topics that we have on here in the day-to-day stuff of the Steelers. We mentioned yesterday, if people wanted it, we would talk about it. We brought Chris on here. We're going to talk about the Hall of Fame candidacies of James Harrison and Hines Ward. But first and foremost, we do got to give a little bit of a rundown with some injury updates. Kenny said he feels fine, and I'm sure everybody by now has seen the video of Minkah Fitzpatrick back at practice. So where are we at with those two things? I was very skeptical about Minkah coming back, but after watching this video of him back at practice, got to feel a little bit better that he was able to get in some work on a Wednesday.
Yeah, Mon Adams told me he feels like he's good to go too. So it seems like Adams and Fitzpatrick are back. Kenny said he's fine. Like, it's just something they're just giving him some time off in practice maybe. And the only, I think, question mark at this point is Calvin Austin. Not quite sure whether we're going to see him this week or not.
Yeah. And Chris, I'll bring you into this, and something that we've been asked about on here. We had as a topic on Monday, and then somebody really wanted us to dig in further on it yesterday, is Trenton Thompson, and how does he continue to find a role in this defense, even with Minkah coming back? Is it just in that Keanu Neal role? I think specifically when you look at Arizona, this is a really good matchup for Trenton Thompson because they have an emerging tight end in Trey McBride that he can match up really well with. But what are your thoughts on Trenton Thompson going forward, even with Minkah coming back in the fold?
I like Trenton Thompson and what he's brought to the table. There's been moments where he's kind of just been like, and then there's definitely been some miscommunication breakdowns. I think he was part of the communication breakdown on the touchdown that they allowed to the tight end. But he's also done so many communication non-breakdowns, like times where he's correctly understood what the adjustment was, been part of disguising. And that's another thing I want to point out. The Steelers are disguising a whole lot. Like, I remember covering this team back when Artie Burns and like Cody Sensabaugh and Mike Mitchell was the secondary. And what you saw was what you get. Like that defense, they were not able to like switch out of coverages and try to confuse you nearly as much week in and week out. It was basically like, hey, either the quarterback's stupid and throws it to you guys, or our pass rush wins. And that was kind of how the Steelers defense kind of won in the pass game. Or Ryan Shazier was just a freak of nature for a few years. So there's but nowadays with Terrell Austin, and I said this when they made him the hire, and a lot of people were complaining about it. I'm like, Terrell Austin, he's that DB's guy that's going to give you all of those changes, all those switch ups. It's not going. You're never going to recapture the 2008 defense. It's just the NFL isn't built for that, and I think that's where some Steelers fans are just like, oh man, this defense stinks. Meanwhile, they're giving up the 5th fewest points in the league, the 6th fewest rushing touchdowns, 10th fewest passing touchdowns. They're top 3 in turnovers. Like they're doing all the things, and they've never played a single game with Minkah Fitzpatrick, Cam Hayward, or TJ Watt. All 3 start to finish being healthy in a game. If you had told me that it happened, I would say, this defense is probably middling, and this team is not in a position to be in a playoff race unless the offense exploded. The offense has not exploded, and yet they are still doing just that. So I think that part of what Trenton Thompson has done is fit into that formula, and that is not easy to do. That takes coordination, that takes practice, that takes understanding, and he's done it well. And I think that there's testament due to him, but also due to Terrell Austin and to the Steelers staff for preparing him to be a part of that. So I think that as it stands, like, a guy like Shannon Sullivan, who actually I thought before the Bengals game, I thought he was actually starting to show some good signs here and there. His missed sack was kind of disappointing. With Minkah Fitzpatrick back, I'd be considering, can Trenton Thompson fit in some roles that Shannon Sullivan fills, especially when it comes to stuffing the run and blitzing the quarterback.
Yeah, I like that a lot too. Alan, anything else to add?
Also, just on those same sort of statistical note, the Steelers defense is 11th in yards per play. The only reason their yardage totals stink is that the offense gives the other team the ball every 4th down, and they are always on the field. They're fine on a per play basis on defense in terms of yardage. They're just on the field too much. So I think people are underselling how good this defense is right now. Trenton Thompson, obviously not some kind of huge part of it, but I think just sort of indicative of the things they've been able to do despite not having a lot of their top personnel.
Right. Absolutely. And like Chris mentioned, any Steelers defense is going to draw comparisons to the defenses of 2008. Let's talk about the biggest member of that defense of 2008, former Defensive Player of the Year, James Harrison, up for the Hall of Fame. As Steelers fans, I think that we can obviously, go with our hearts a lot of the time. So let's talk about these legitimate candidacies of James Harrison, Hines Ward. We'll start with James Harrison just because of that segue that I just made and talk about this. I mean, you talk about a guy that really didn't break onto the scene as a full-time starter until he was like 29 years old. But that 5-year run that he had at the top of his game, that run of dominance that he had, as good as anybody else. So like, how do you evaluate James Harrison's career in totality and talk about his Hall of Fame candidacy?
I mean, if I was to start, I'd say James Harrison was the best edge rusher in football for about half a decade. And that, I think that deserves some sort of credit for what the Hall of Fame should be. And like to me, when I think of Hall of Fame, the classic question, I don't just look at your stats. I look at can we talk about the NFL and the era that you played in without talking about you? You know what I'm saying? And that's why when people argue against Eli Manning because of stats or whatever, I'm like, look, that dude won 2 Super Bowls and is the only guy that he beat Tom Brady twice. I'm sorry, his stats are good enough that if I throw that on top, I have to be able to talk about him. And if I'm talking about that era of football, I'm talking about James Harrison. It's necessary. Sure. That guy dominated. That guy had one of the greatest plays in Super Bowl history, and he has 85 plus sacks in his career. He terrorized offenses for many years. 5-time Pro Bowler, 2-time All-Pro, a Defensive Player of the Year on top of that. That's a Hall of Fame resume. Now, does he jump ahead of some of the other guys that are there? That's a more interesting question. But James Harrison should be in there. I think it'll take him some more tries before he definitely is in there. But I think that he is a Hall of Fame type player.
I think James Harrison is the easier of these two to really talk about because James Harrison was
I agree.
not just the best defense edge rusher. You can make a very good argument. There was like a 3 or 4 year period where he was the best defensive player in all of football, and the only real competition for that was his own safety. Like, he was that good. Deservingly NFL Defensive Player of the Year, deservingly multi-time All-Pro. I understand that he did not have a long peak to his career. Like, he was not, like Larry Fitzgerald, but he was like this great player for 10, 12, 15 seasons. His career had a long ramp up, and then he had this kind of tail where he wasn't really the same kind of guy towards the end. But he was too good in those times where he was good to ignore. Like, he was such a dominant player that like Tony Baselli, who is in the Hall of Fame, has a similar kind of problem where he was great, and it was only great for a short period. Then his career gets cut off by injury. Like, I don't really think why that peak is short matters. Like, the peak is short, that's fine. That peak is notable. Like, teams spent about $500 million in free agency to try to find the next Tony Baselli. He was the blueprint that every football team was looking for. He was the archetype of what the new passing NFL teams needed at tackle. You can say very similar things about James Harrison. In fact, I think James Harrison really changed the mold for what, like, the athleticism of an edge rusher in the NFL compared to the pure size strength combination. Like, he was a different mold than guys like Bruce Smith. Like, he wasn't that just big brute. He was small. He was undrafted for a reason. He was probably too small based on the size standard of his position. But he changed the mold of what that position is to now we look at a guy like Micah Parsons. Like, he fits that same size mold that didn't exist really before James Harrison. And so I just think you can't ignore the guy's ability, his time at the top of the league, and not just his position, but among all defensive players. And I really don't think there are, sometimes I think guys get pushed back in the Hall of Fame pecking order because there's these log jams, right? Either there are a lot of guys from the teams they were on, or there are a lot of guys at their positions that end up taking space in front of them. Well, Troy's already been in and has been in for a little while. Ben's got a couple years before he's on the table. I don't think there is that logjam for Harrison right now. And I think he compares favorably to the other edge rusher types that are out there right now. So I think it's a very easy decision for me that not only should James Harrison be a Hall of Famer, but I think sooner rather than later. Like, I feel like this is one that we should expect to happen.
I really liked what Chris said about, can you talk about the lead when he was playing without talking about him? The answer is no. I mean, one of the most memorable moments in Super Bowl 43 as well. I mean, you cannot talk about Super Bowls, what everybody is playing for, without thinking about that moment, that pick six, James Harrison taking Kurt Warner back to the house. So to have that type of moment on top of all the accolades, Defensive Player of the Year, 4 All-Pros, 2 times as a first-time All-Pro, Super Bowl 43 champion, that moment in Super Bowl 43, I think while it wasn't a long run, the run that he had, what's crazy is you think about, I mentioned he became a full-time starter at the age of 29. That's how old TJ Watt is right now. Like, imagine if TJ just now started doing what TJ Watt was doing. It would be crazy if he ends up having the back half of the career like James Harrison had during his peak. But yeah, for me, it's a yes as well. Obviously, I feel like with me, some bias would play into it. So I'm glad that you two are in agreement with me as well.
I'm right with you guys. Like, and I'm looking at the other modern era semifinalists. Jared Allen is another edge rusher that comes to mind there. And like, Jared Allen was a fun guy to watch. He was definitely talented, definitely deserves to be in the Hall of Fame someday, but not over James Harrison. He never took over entire seasons the way that man did. And again, did it on winning teams. Because again, to me, I think there's such like I think in the analytics community, there's such a want to push away success in winning moments from analysis of players, and that should not happen. And James Harrison absolutely brought that so many times for the Steelers. I mean, even when he was old man James Harrison, if he's not on the field against the Chiefs, they don't win that playoff game, against Alex Smith. When he's just, you know what, I'm gonna just come in and just wreck something at the end of this game. There saves the game, gets them to the AFC Championship game that week. And again, that was old man James Harrison. They would just bring him in just for those moments. They got, other defenders on this list. Dwight Freeney, another guy, I think a great player, didn't get to the height that James Harrison got, longer, I'd say, as far as what he was able to do, but not the same. Looking at other guys here, Rodney Harrison, again, great player, but not at the level of James Harrison. Robert Mathis, same as Dwight Freeney, Julius Peppers, other guys like that. I'm right with you, Alan and Zach. I think that James Harrison, he ranks above, if not right with all of those defenders.
Two more things I want to say about James Harrison. The second one I think can segue into the next point. One is I agree with Smitty. I think that the play in the Super Bowl itself is a real boost to his candidacy. Why is Franco Harris the third Steeler to get his jersey retired? Because he had the immaculate reception and nobody else did. I mean, it's not like Franco Harris was that much more notable or necessary to the Steelers winning 4 Super Bowls than, I don't know, Terry Bradshaw or Mike Webster or Jack Lambert, right? But Mel Blount, but he had that and those guys didn't, right? And I think that Super Bowl moment that the entire world saw, I think that is a big boost to Harrison's candidacy. The second thing is, I think, look, I say this all the time, it is the Hall of Fame. It is not the Hall of Great. Like Jared Allen is the perfect example of a very good football player that I know absolutely nothing about, nor do I care to. He has no story, no personality. There's no flair. There's nothing to him. If Jared Allen walked through any shopping center in America outside of Minneapolis, Minnesota tomorrow, he'd be completely unrecognized. I have no idea what the guy looks like. Like he's not famous. He's just not. He's a good football player, great football player. James Harrison, because of his backstory and because of his personality, is a guy who you can't avoid talking about. Like Chris said, he's famous. He's a significant guy because of that, and I think that matters. And I think it matters for Hines Ward too.
The one thing I'll say about Jared Allen is that it makes it tough to ignore when he has 136 sacks. And you're absolutely right. Like the story isn't there, but the raw numbers of that man sacked as many people as Ricky Jackson, almost as many people as John Randall, those type of guys. Again, I think someday he deserves it, but I agree with you that
I just wouldn't put him over Harris.
I agree. That's where we're on the same page there.
All right, let's talk about the one that, again, is tougher case to make in Hines Ward, as I think that we're all going to end up agreeing here. But, Chris, we'll start with you again in terms of Hines Ward. Just bring up some types of stuff with him here, though. Top 15 all-time in catches. You could argue the best blocking receiver in NFL history. Over 12,000 receiving yards, 85 touchdowns. Of course, won 2 rings with the Pittsburgh Steelers. Why or why not do you believe Hines Ward should be a Hall of Famer?
He should be a Hall of Famer. He should.
Okay.
And I'll explain why. If these guys were to stop right now, would they be Hall of Famers? DeAndre Hopkins, Devontae Adams, and guys who already did stop and are in the Hall. Calvin Johnson, guys like that. They all have less receiving yards than Hines Ward. Like right now, and D-Hop can pass Hines Ward very soon because he's very close. But those are guys that retired with less receiving yards. And if your knock on Hines Ward is that he's not high enough because you think he's 27th in receiving yards all time. If your knock on him is that he's not high enough in that mark, okay, fine, fair. But you know what? That guy also played with Cordell Stewart, with Tommy Maddox, with Kent Graham until about 2004 when young Ben Roethlisberger came in, and he didn't even get the best passing version of Ben Roethlisberger. It'd be, if Hines Ward came along in the 20, like when Antonio Brown did, I bet you that he might not have Antonio Brown numbers, but his numbers would be better than they were because he would have been able to mature with Ben Roethlisberger and get a lot more, better situations for him to get big yards. And I think it would have been more conducive to him to get those big plays. But Hines Ward, for his era, he's another guy that I think we're all about to agree here. I can more easily not talk about him than James Harrison, but I think if I'm talking about the 2000s of NFL football, Hines Ward has to come up in a conversation. One, for his Super Bowl 40, MVP, but also two, for how he would just knock people out. I mean, he made the Ravens feared him. Ed Reed, one of the greatest safeties to ever play, would get so flustered, not just for the hit that Hines Ward laid him out for in 2007, but there would be so many games where Ed Reed would point at the ref and point at Hines. He's like, he's doing this to me. He's doing this to me. You can't let him do this to me. And it would just, that is when, and Hines Ward would just smile and be like, hey, hey, hey. He was that terrorizing to defensive players. Ray Lewis couldn't stand him. That on top of his playmaking ability, his timeliness for big plays, and his leadership, because when he came to the Steelers in the late 90s, there was no leader in the receiver room. It was Yancey Thigpen had just left. They were struggling. Charles Johnson wasn't the answer. And then when Plaxico Burress came in, he was a boost, but Plaxico wasn't a leader. And Hines Ward could be that leader. He's the one that helped Antoine Randall get better, and he helped guys over so many years get better. And he set the floor for when the Young Money crew came in. They kind of took it over for themselves, but there was a standard set by Hines Ward, and that was so important. Beyond just the Steelers, I think Hines Ward, with his numbers, with his clutch moments, with his personality, he's another guy I would consider for the Hall of Fame. But as we are saying, he would go after James Harrison, in my opinion, because James Harrison was a Defensive Player of the Year. Hines Ward was never in the conversation to get Offensive Player of the Year or anything like that. I don't think he even does he have a first-team All-Pro under his belt? I don't think he does. He has 4 Pro Bowls. He's never even second-team All-Pro. So I think that's part of the argument there.
Yeah, I think that's the big problem with Hines Ward, right? Is that when we talk, the reason Harrison is easy for me is his dominance at his position compared to the rest of the league during the peak of his career. It would be a stretch to me to say that there was any time in his career that Hines Ward was a top 5 wide receiver in the NFL. It maybe top 10, but probably not top 5. There were and the big problem is that he's coming up with right now is while his compared to history receiving totals are fine for a Hall of Fame wide receiver, there are 7 or 8 guys in line with him right now with better numbers that were better players than him
Torrey Holt
statistically in the league at the same time that he was. I have a hard time putting Hines Ward over Torrey Holt, over Anquan Bolden, over Andre Johnson, who I did get in. But those guys, it's hard. To me, Hines Ward is a guy that's going to have to wait a while because it's gonna be hard to value the intangible over the tangible. I think is always hard, and he didn't have that peak to his career where he was one of the best wide receivers in the game. Never an All-Pro, never led the league in receiving yards. And he didn't play for a great offense like some of those guys did, and he certainly brought a lot to the table in terms of the way he played the position, changed the league rule book. That's a big deal, but I think it's hard to get that stuff in front of guys who played at the same time with better statistical contributions. And the thing that worries me about Hines Ward is, okay, so if I think, well, he's just going to have to wait his turn. He's going to have to wait for Bolden and Holt and Steve Smith and all these other guys to come through. Well, I mean, what happens when the next, because it's not like it's any less of a passing league right now. What happens when we get to Tyreek Hill and Devontae Adams and A.J. Brown? And, does there become that sweet spot where there's a good place for him to get in? I don't know. I think if you just gave me, Hines Ward, yes or no, is he a Hall of Famer, I would say yes. But I think if I'm in that room and I have to pick between the people that are on this list, I would have a hard time picking Hines Ward as one of my guys that I wanted in.
Yeah. I wanted to add to this too. I really liked how Tomlin put it yesterday in terms of saying he was a football player first and a wide receiver second, because if you just eliminate the fact that he played receiver and just think about what he brought as a football player. I mean, if you think about, again, I think he's the best blocking receiver of all time. I'm not trying to relate it one-to-one to the conversation people have about Devin Hester. He should be in because he did one thing the best out of anybody else. But if Hines Ward is the absolute best at one thing, is that enough to put him in just based off that? I think that's an interesting conversation and part to have brought into the conversation. Yes, I don't really tough one for me.
It's also just like you guys are talking. We're talking about how many great receivers are there in general. Like it's just a very tough position to make it. The guy who I always wore the jersey of that was never a Steeler, but I always had it because of obvious reasons. Chris Carter. It took Chris Carter 5 years of Hall of Fame eligibility to make it into the Hall. And there was like a long time growing up, like as a kid, when Randy Moss was emerging, before like Randy Moss and Larry Fitzgerald and Terrell Owens and those guys came around, there was a legitimate conversation that maybe Chris Carter was the second best wide receiver in NFL history behind Jerry Rice. Like that used to be a debate that people had, like where did Chris Carter rank? Now, so many receivers have flooded the NFL since then, and now he's like not even in the top 10, top 15. But I think that when you look at like guys like that guy had to wait 5 years of Hall of Fame eligibility before he could get in. So if we're comparing people, Hines Ward doesn't even get to that level, and that's where I think that it's just very tough to do it at for the receiver position. So I'm with you guys. This is a harder thing. I think that someday Hines should get his flowers. He should get in there. I think it might end up being a thing where like Alan and I are dead and Smitty's somewhere like telling all the old kids around the campfire about, that's my favorite wide receiver of all time, guys.
Well, you know what? I think that is actually one of the things that like the Veterans Committee is there for, is to pick up those guys that maybe meant something more to the players on the field than they did to maybe the statistical record books or to the public at large. And I really do think that I think Hines Ward would have a better chance of being a Hall of Famer if it was voted on by players than by the media. Like, I think he was a guy that had the respect of his fellow competitors because of his toughness and the way he played the game. And I do think that's kind of like what that Veterans Committee is sort of exactly designed for. So I could see that being the way forward for Hines Ward. And I'll say this too, like, I've talked to a lot of people around the NFL about this, and like, Hines was never really very shy about putting his face in front of the camera when he was a player. He wasn't like, above, some self-promotion or that kind of thing. I think Hines probably would do well to find himself in front of a camera on NFL Sundays somewhere to kind of keep himself in that I think Steve Smith is doing a very good job of keeping his name relevant in NFL circles by what he's doing right now on television.
Absolutely.
And I know Hines was a coach in the XFL. That's very clearly not the same thing. I think he would do pretty well for his case to get in front of people's faces on a more regular basis.
Remember, he used to do the Sunday night show with like Tony Dungy. Like that was where I thought that he was gonna be in there, but he hasn't been like that. After that stint, he hasn't gotten another chance like that. And I don't know if that's because he doesn't want to do TV, if he prefer to be a coach, but I agree with you. That's part of it. Is it would help him to stay in the conversation. But now the only people who talk about Hines Ward right now are people like Steelers fans and people like us who got to bring it up on podcasts. Like, that guy was pretty tough for his era, and he could probably play in every era in the NFL. But yeah, I do think part of it is, it would help for him to be out there more.
I mean, let's circle the conversation back, right? We're talking all week about the reaction to Deontay Johnson's, mishap against the Bengals. Man, whose opinion would you care to hear about more than Hines Ward about that, right? Like I put a camera and a microphone in front of that guy and tell me what you think about the effort that Deontay Johnson was playing with on Sunday, because you never saw anything like that from Hines Ward. You can say that for sure.
Or like one of our audience members suggested, he takes over for Frisman Jackson next season.
Hey,
people have been calling that for years, man.
I think the fans call for former players to coach for the team is generally like a not very smart or realistic thought, but we had a very honest conversation about Frisman Jackson the other day, and how I think it's likely that the team is going to move on from him as wide receivers coach. So I mean, look, offensive coordinator was Hines Ward a head coach or an OC in the XFL? Was he a head coach, right?
I'm not sure. Let me check real quick.
I think he was a head coach. Rod Woodson was a head coach. I think Hines Ward was too.
Yeah, he was one of the 8
Head
XFL
coach.
head coaches for the
San Antonio Brahmas.
XFL head coach to NFL wide receivers coach is not an unrealistic jump here. Like I think this is not Wise and Ben, the offensive coordinator. Like this one feels a little bit more like a realistic possibility than maybe some of the other things that fans have thrown out there in terms of former players coaching for the team.
And he was an intern in 2017 and assistant for the Jets in 2019 and 2020. Florida Atlantic wide receivers coach in 2021. But that might be my pause there is how did he not stick anywhere? Because that's a guy who's been a Super Bowl MVP. That's a guy who's been an NFL player and like he was a leader of the locker room. Like Hines Ward was very much like the guy that everyone galvanized a lot of people. And you think like I'd want that as my coach. So not to say like there's anything malicious there or anything terrible there, but I think that there's some reason to call into question why he wouldn't have been in more conversations to get more or stuck with a job longer. And heck, again, he was with the Steelers in 2017 as an intern. You think that there'd be something there like they'd want to retain that. So I don't know. Big questions.
I agree. Interesting conversation. I'll be curious what the people in the audience think about that. Of course, leave us your comments. Let us know how you feel about both James Harrison and Hines Ward's candidacies. And you know what? Let us know how you feel about the idea of Hines Ward becoming the Pittsburgh Steelers wide receiver coach as well. We want to hear all of it in the comments. Chris, tell the people where they can find you.
You can always find me at Carter Critiques on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and every single platform out there. You can find my written work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, post-gazette.com. Find my podcast, the North Shore Drive podcast with Post-Gazette Sports, as well as the Locked On Steelers podcast the same way you find all podcasts, your favorite podcasting apps, and on YouTube.
I feel like you just gotta like roll out a scroll and just read
I have a
everything.
CVS receipt, yes.
Yeah. Alan, tell the people where they can find you.
At Saunders _PGH on X, PGH Steelers Now is the site's account, SteelersNow.com. It's where you get all the good stuff from me, Nick Faribault, Derek Bell, the whole rest of the team, and Smitty's just poor posting of this podcast is also there every day. So, you know, I need you guys to check up on him apparently and make sure he does a good job because, you know, go there, read the words so I can get paid.
Not quite as many things listed there, Alan, but like, subscribe, hit that notification bell here, leave us a comment down below. Like I said, if you're listening somewhere else, whether it's Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, any of your favorite platforms, leave us a 5-star review over there. Thanks again to Chris Carter for joining us. For Chris, Alan, and myself, thanks for jumping in, take another ride on the Steelers Afternoon Drive.